as he grew to adulthood, he was making his living as a trapper. But then he did what many of us do. He fell in love and had to settle down a little bit more, had a couple of daughters, made a living as a journalist, worked even as a politician, back in the day when politicians actually had other jobs, and so he didn't have to spend all of his time in the Capitol. And he wrote several other books containing Native American mythic stories before he published the ethnographies of Plenty Coups and Pretty Shield. One of the things that I find interesting is that he doesn't mention Plenty Coups and Pretty Shield very much at all in his autobiography. And what this tells me is I was reading his book for a purpose. That was my purpose, right? But his purpose was very different. They apparently, these two people didn't have as much effect on his overall life as he is known for now. He's much more known for transcribing these ethnographies than he is for anything else. But he never lost this desire to have the West remain that kind of mythic West that we see in Western movies, right? And even toward the end of his life, when the country had transformed dramatically, right? When he dies in the late 1930s, the United States is much more industrialized, and people aren't living the frontier life. They may be dressing up like frontier people every once in a while, but they're not living that life. He goes to New York City to plead with his publisher to give him a little more money, which writers are always doing. But while he's there, he stays in a hotel and he hears something. And this is very close to the end of the book. He says, "My room at Scott's was excellent. Its tall French windows opened up on the street. But leaning out, I could catch glimpses of the lights on shipping passing up and down East River, where tugs and steamships continually whistled signals I had learned when a small boy. However, the noises outside and finally the peculiar odor of fog that had settled over the city kept me awake. As the fog thickened, the whistles on tugs and steamships grew louder and more frequent, their tones ranging from high falsettos to deep, shivering blasts that seemed to make the whole island of Manhattan tremble. Sleep would not come, even when finally the fog lifted and the ceiling showed reflections of the dawn. I watched the gray light grow, wishing that it were time to get up. And then suddenly I heard familiar sounds, horses' hooves and horse bells in New York. The bells sounded as though a band of horses might be going up 87th on a fast trot. With a thrill of pleasure, I hopped out of bed and ran to the window. Just beneath me on my side of the street, an ice wagon drawn by one fat horse was jogging merrily by, the animal's shod hoofs clattering on the pavement, and across the street, close to the curb, I saw a flat-footed Hebrew pushing a two-wheeled cart bearing 4 horse bells strung on a jiggling wire, so that the bells jingled exactly as though they were on the necks of trotting horses. Chagrined, I glanced at the glass door that opened into the hall to see if anybody was there to laugh at my mistake. But nobody was yet stirring. I got back into bed to wait. Long before anybody in the Scott home was up, the city was wide awake and busy. Later on, I learned that it never sleeps. All right, so he is very nostalgic here at the end of his life. Nostalgic for the kind of West that he had imagined as a young boy that probably never really existed. Right? That's kind of the definition of nostalgia, when we miss something that never really existed in the first place. He ends the autobiography with, I think, kind of a sad statement. He's talking about boys that he sees in New York City, and I'm not sure that I entirely believe his interpretation of what they're doing, but this is what he says. In its clanging streets, one sees even the primitive struggling for expression. The makings of plainsmen and mountaineers are there if only opportunity could use them. Small boys kindle fires in the gutters to huddle about them, pretending that they are in deep wilderness. Looking down 87th Street of an evening, one may see a dozen of these fires kept burning with broken boxes and old newspapers. Grouped about each are small boys who talk mysteriously of the West, as though it were yet a country filled with grave dangers and was just around the corner. I have slipped up in the shadows and heard them talk. It was good for me. It made me know that East and West, real boys are very much alike, that the old spirit of the pioneer is not dead by a long shot. Nevertheless, I could not help feeling sorry for these little campfire builders in New York City. And yet I do hope that they will dream on. Anticipation is often finer than realization anyhow. That's the sad line. Anticipation is often finer than realization anyhow, and that's the very last line of his autobiography. So it seems as though he feels a fair amount of sorrow here at the end of his life. Okay. So he dies at the end of the 1930s. In 1930, he published, there's Frank, he published his ethnography of Plenty-Coup. Okay. Plenty-Coup was the last traditional Crow chief. Currently, Crow are organized around a tribal council, and they have a tribal council president. Okay, the book, if you purchased it now, it's called Plenty-Coup, Chief of the Crows, but his original title was American, the life story of a great Indian, Plenty-Coup, Chief of the Crows. Okay, and so that's one of the things that really tells me that was his point. He wanted Plenty-Coup to be received as an American by his white audience. In transcribing both of these ethnographies, he was very adamant that he wanted the story of a real old-time Indian. He only wanted to hear about what life was like pre-contact with Europeans. And that's part of the reason he chose these two individuals, Plenty-Coup and Pretty Shield, because they were elderly at this time, and they had lived for a fair number of decades the traditional lifestyle before the reservations were established. Okay. One of the things that happens in these two books, and one of the ways we can tell that Plenty-Coup and Pretty Shield don't have entire control over the telling of the story, is Linderman moves back and forth between the individual story, what we usually expect to see in an autobiography, okay, and a description of the type of person that he's describing. So, for example, he's talking about hunting, right? And he's talking about stereotypes. And he says here, the uninformed have marked the Indian a stoic, and they have been wrong. The Indian is a natural man and loves a joke. He will laugh as readily as his white brother if he is among friends. The chuckling of Plenty-Coup, etc. Okay? So he's using Plenty-Coup as an example here, right, of a type, rather than continuing to focus on the individual Plenty-Coup. Now, a lot of what I'm saying, as I'm talking about particularly Plenty-Coup and Pretty Shield, is going to sound a little bit critical of Linderman. And a lot of what he says to our ears sounds really conservative, even reactionary. But in his time, he was the progressive. And that's one thing we have to really keep in mind. Okay? He was really trying to help various Native American individuals and groups retain as much of their dignity as they could, right? In significant contrast to the people at the time who would have been called conservative, who were saying things like, Indians are just going to die out, we might as well let them. Okay? So, over the course of his life, Plenty-Coup had several visions, and they tell him both about how he can live his life successfully and what his life will be like as he proceeds over several decades. The first one that he tells Linderman about, and in fact he doesn't tell Linderman all of his visions, because some of them needed to be kept private within the tribe, and we know about them because other people have revealed them. But when he tells Linderman about the first one, he concludes with some hesitation. And he specifically asks, he's talking about, he refers to the little people. And they were these figures who had appeared to him in this vision. And he says, "Oh, little people, you who have been my good helpers through a long life, forgive me if I have done wrong in telling this to Sign Talker." That was his name for Linderman, because when they communicated directly, it was through a kind of widespread sign language that was used out in the plains. "I believed I was doing right. Be kind. I shall see you very soon and explain all." So he's worried that he should not have revealed this knowledge to Linderman, a white person who was going to then explain it to thousands of other white people. Okay. His second vision occurs not long after that, and to me it's a really interesting, it's prophetic, and it's a really interesting it calls me to think about what we believe and what we don't believe about how much we know about the future. Okay, so I will read a couple paragraphs of this vision, and I think you'll be able to hear immediately what what the vision is all about. So he says, "Out of the hole in the ground came the buffalo, bulls and cows and calves without number. They spread wide and blackened the plains. Everywhere I looked, great herds of buffalo were going in every direction, and still others without number were pouring out of the hole in the ground to travel on the wide plains. When at last they ceased coming out of the hole in the ground, all were gone. All. There was not one in sight anywhere, even out on the plains. I saw a few antelope on a hillside, but no buffalo. Not a bull, not a cow, not one calf was anywhere on the plains. I turned to look at the man person beside me. He shook his red rattle again. Look, he pointed. Out of the hole in the ground came bulls and cows and calves past counting. These, like the others, scattered and spread on the plains, but they stopped in small bands and began to eat the grass. More lay down, not as a buffalo does, but differently, and many were spotted. Hardly any two were alike in color or size, and the bulls bellowed differently too, not deep and far-sounding like the bulls of the buffalo, but sharper and yet weaker in my ears. Their tails were different, longer, and nearly brushed the ground. They were not buffalo. These were strange animals from another world. And then he goes on, he's very afraid of this, and he goes on, and then he sees an old man. And this other person's, he says, then I saw the spring down by those trees, this very house just as it is, these trees which comfort us today, and a very old man sitting in the shade alone. I felt pity for him because he was so old and feeble. Look well upon this old man, said the man person. Do you know him, Plenty-Coup? He asked me. No, I said, looking closely at the old man's face in the shade of this tree. This old man is yourself, Plenty-Coup, he told me. And then I could see the man person no more. He was gone, and so too was the old man. So he has this vision of the future where the buffalo are all going to be gone, and cattle are going to take over the plains. And then he sees himself as he is at the time he's telling the story to Linderman. Okay? And in a sense, it's very sad, right? And he will say over and over again, he refuses to tell Linderman anything that happened after the buffalo went away. He says, everything that happened that was meaningful to me happened before that point. Okay? On the other hand, he also was very invested in the future. And he adapted fairly well to the fact that the United States was about to cover the whole land as he knew it. He encouraged young Crow men to fight in World War I, which they did. He represented the Crow in Washington as they negotiated treaties. He represented all Native American people at the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Okay, and I've tried to find out how did they choose Plenty-Coup, right? One of the advantages of working at a university is you work with a lot of people who know a lot of things. And I asked one of my historian colleagues, how can I find this out? And he said, contact the National Archives. So I did, but they don't know either, right? They just know Plenty-Coup was there, and there are photographs, and there's a long description of the event in newspapers, but nobody knows, there's no documentation that I can find about why he was selected, okay, but he was. And then he read a story about George Washington and how when Washington died, he left Mount Vernon to be established as a national park. And he thought, I want to do that too. And so he did the same thing. When he died, he left his property to be converted into a state park in Montana, and it was. Okay. However, at the very end of the book, it's not Plenty-Coup speaking anymore. It's Linderman, the last chapter. Plenty-Cou's voice isn't even present in the very last chapter. And Linderman says Plenty-Coup was always a patriotic American, and then he summarizes why he believes that. And then he says, because old-time redmen of the Northwest dated births by events in their tribal histories or by extremely freakish seasons, there is often room for error in naming the year of an old Indian's nativity according to our calendar. Even there, that pronoun, right? There's us and them, okay? So he's almost subverting his own purpose by referring to other Americans as our and Plenty-Cou's people as them. Plenty-Coup may easily have been several years older than he believed. Anyhow, I know that he was weary and that he was ready, even a little anxious, to go to the beyond country when the call came to him on the 4th of March, 1932. May he, my old friend, find the buffalo there and live with them forever in perpetual summer. So that's another characteristic of the writing that distinguishes ethnography from autobiography. Okay? And my greater argument, okay, in looking at these texts is that if you are the subject of an ethnography, you're an outsider. So if we're talking about national membership, if you're an author of an autobiography, you're an insider. If you're a subject of an ethnography, you're an outsider. Okay? So that's Plenty-Coup. Then Pretty Shield, her ethnography was published a couple of years later. It was originally called Red Mother, which and it did not sell. And Linderman was quite upset, quite disappointed. Part of the reason for that is most readers were kind of tired of reading Native American old stories of the frontier. Okay, they were much more interested in reading the war stories of the 20th century, for instance. But I also think, and many people think, the title was very unfortunate. His publisher tried to get him to change the title, not to call it Red Mother. Currently it's called Pretty Shield, Medicine Women of the Crow. And it's an unfortunate title in that time period because it evoked communism. Right? So it didn't evoke Native American identity as strongly as it evoked other things, and so failed to attract an audience. However, Pretty Shield herself is a very interesting woman. She was a medicine woman. She had a much harder time accepting the way history was moving and the suggestions about what the future was going to hold for Crow. Okay, and she also had a very sad life. Her daughters died at a young age. So Alma Hogan Snell, whose autobiography I'll talk about in just a minute, was raised by Pretty Shield because her own mother had died when she was very young. And so Pretty Shield raised all these grandchildren because her own children had died. But she was having a very hard time with this cultural shift. And she was having a very hard time adjusting to how do you raise children who are 2 generations younger than you rather than just one. And she found herself relying on other strategies that she felt some dismay about. Okay? Traditionally, Native American people didn't use much corporal punishment, okay, the way Europeans did. They told a lot of stories, right? And the children were supposed to learn from those stories how you behaved. But she got very frustrated. And she tells very early on this story about how she punished one of her grandchildren. And she says, she stopped short, her lips pressed tightly together. Lately I did strike a child, she said grimly. There seemed to be nothing else to do. Times and children have changed so. One of my great-granddaughters ran off to a dance with a bad young man after I had told her that she must not go. I went after her. It was a long way too, but I got her and in time. I brought her home to my place and used a saddle strap on her. I struck hard, sighed Talker. I hope it helped her, and yet I felt ashamed of striking my grandchild. I am trying to live a life that I do not understand. Right? This idea that she had adopted methods of punishment that she really felt were unethical really bothered her for a long time, even though, by the time she's telling this story, she's very close to the end of her life, right? And there is another book that you might be interested in. It's called Bad Indians by a woman named Deborah Miranda, who lives in Virginia, I think. And what she's trying to figure out from her own life is how Native families have become so violent sometimes, and it's often linked to the use of alcohol, when, if you read some of the anthropological material and material from the 19th century and earlier, these same Native nations did not engage in any kind of corporal punishment like that. And there was, Europeans would write about them as feeling so much affection, displaying so much affection for their children, right? And so Miranda, in that book, Bad Indians, that's part of her motive in writing that book, is to try to figure out what happened, right? So Pretty Shield is trying to adjust, and she really has a hard time. Now, one of the things that occurs in both Plenty Coup and Pretty Shield is a lengthy discussion of the Battle of Little Bighorn, which also tells me that Linderman was guiding the discussion, because although it's about 50 years after this battle when he's taking these ethnographies down, Americans had been just astonished that Custer had lost. and that this massacre had occurred, the so-called massacre. For one thing, it occurred in 1876 as the nation, just a few days before the 4th of July, as America is about to celebrate its centennial. And George Custer had this reputation as being almost immortal. He had been such a daredevil as a soldier in the Civil War that people really believed he couldn't be killed. And yet there he was, killed with all his men. And the country was in this depression, financial depression. So when the news got to the East Coast that Custer and the 7th Cavalry had been decimated, people really could not believe it, and they continued to obsess over it for decades, and we still do, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of books written about Custer. So in Plenty Coup, the Custer chapter is central. It's one of the longest chapters in the book, and it's right in the middle. And Pretty Shield is also the longest chapter in the book, and it's right toward the end. But if you look at Crow versions of Crow history, that battle is just one item in a long list of other things that they consider much more important. Okay? So this emphasis that we see in both of these books tell us more about what Linnerman was looking for and what he expected his audience would be looking for than it does about perhaps what was important to Plenty Coup and Pretty Shield. But then right at the end, she's very sad also, but she had a very fond relationship with him. And but she also believes that really not much happened after the buffalo went away, and that's the expression they use. Okay, but she is more directly critical of white people than Plenty Coup was. And she says, sign talker, she said, leaning toward me, white cowboys met a deaf and dumb Crow boy on the plains, and because he could not answer their questions, could not even hear what they said, they roped him and dragged him to death. Tell me what happened when the buffalo went away, I urged. No, that's Linnerman. I find that a very peculiar transition, right? No response in this book to her telling that story. Tell me what happened when the buffalo went away. Sickness came, strange sickness that nobody knew about when there was no meat, she said, covering her face with both hands as though to shut out the sight of suffering. My daughter stepped into a horse's track that was deep in the dried clay and hurt her ankle. I could not heal her, nobody could. The white doctor told me that the same sickness that makes people cough themselves to death was in my daughter's ankle. And then she goes on, and then she says, my heart fell down when I began to see dead buffalo scattered all over our beautiful country, killed and skinned and left to rot by white men, many, many hundreds of buffalo. The first I saw of this was in the Judith Basin. The whole country there smelled of rotting meat. And yet nobody believed even then that the white men could kill all the buffalo, right? But they do. And they keep believing somehow there have to be more buffalo somewhere. And she says, we believed for a long time that the buffalo would again come to us, but they did not. We grew hungry and sick and afraid, all in one. And that's just 2 pages before the end of the book. Okay, so in many ways it's very sad, but she also presents herself in a very caring way, especially about the children. And even though she's a character, I feel a real affection for her. Okay, as I do for her granddaughter, Alma Hogan Snell, who wrote a very different autobiography, and it is a true autobiography rather than an ethnography. Although she's telling it, she's narrating it, and an editor named Becky Matthews is actually transcribing it and arranging it. Okay, about half of this book focuses on Pretty Shield. So that's very interesting that she really is responding as Pretty Shield's granddaughter. So she tells a lot of stories about Pretty Shield and about what it was like to grow up being raised by Pretty Shield. Okay, and then and she tells us a little bit about how Pretty Shield responded to Frank Linderman, and they had this strong friendship. She says he was in a car, this is Linderman, that looked like a Model T Ford. Sometimes he had a horse. Okay, I remember his slick boots, his shiny boots, kind of brown and up to the knee. She continues to describe him, and then she talks about how he would just listen as the women talked to each other. He would just listen. And she says, I'd watch this man because he was so different from other men. He was very kind to us. He would take time to talk with us and ask us little questions and make us feel like we were wanted around him. But other times he paid no attention to us, as this is when I would be watching him, right? So she observes him too. And she says a couple paragraphs later, I liked him because I know he liked me, right? He looked at us like he wanted to know all about us. He was good. Everybody, in fact, loved him. All the people that knew him, that got acquainted with him. Okay, so Linderman had a very positive reputation among the Crow. Okay, even decades after he died, and she's writing this autobiography at the end of the 20th century. Okay. One of the biggest changes that occurs here is that Alma Hogan Snell converted to Christianity. And she talks about that at length in this book. And she says the stories of Jesus gave the people hope when there was no hope. Right? The buffalo are gone. Their whole lifestyle is gone. The men don't have anything to do but sit around on the reservation. And so there was this religion of hope that was brought in, and so she converts. And she's very active in the church. And then she starts thinking about tradition. And one of the things she does is become an herbalist, as Pretty Shield had been a medicine woman. And she relearns a lot of the traditional medicinal plants and how to use them and that sort of thing, and begins teaching it to children. She did a lot of work in elementary schools. And one of the things that she really talks about then is how she can identify herself as both Crow and modern, as both Crow and Christian, and how she defines for herself what it means to be Crow, as opposed to other people being able to define what a so-called real Indian is or not. Okay. And she had this vision when she's worried about this. She's worried about whether she should be following this traditional use of herbal medicines or not, right? Is that consistent with modernity, and is it consistent with Christianity? And she has this dream, okay? And she has decided to quit, right? And then she has this dream. And she says, in the dream, right behind my house here, above the horizon, just behind my house, a light came. A light came as I was standing there holding something in my left hand, which I didn't see when the light came. The light didn't have a form of a man or anything like that, but it had a billowy look about it. It came and just saturated me with light. All over me, all around me was light. I was grasping this thing in my left hand. When the light came on, I was awed by it. Yet I wanted to see what I had in my hand, and I couldn't see it because of the light. It enveloped everything. I couldn't see what was in my hand, but my attention went to the right. As I had my hand out to this great light, there stood Pretty Shield. Not really standing on the ground, but kind of on the cloud in the light. And she had a white gown, a white garment on, and her hair was down. It was long to her waist almost. She was a young girl. I thought, Pretty Shield. In my mind, I thought, Pretty Shield. She said, "It's okay. It's all right." As I observed her saying, "It's all right," I knew she meant not to give it up. It's all right. It's good. Do not be afraid. I looked up to the light again, and this huge being way up there in the cloud form, which was the light, started to kind of draw itself in. I looked in my left hand, and I had a turnip in my hand, and that turnip had its foliage hanging on it yet, and its root in my hand. I woke up to that, so I felt I must go on. So she has this vision, Pretty Shield telling her that this herbal practice is a good thing. So she continues with it, and she did pretty much until she died in the year 2008. Okay? So, if you'd like to know more about the crow, there are a bunch of books you can read. The one I have up here by Hoxie is particularly good about crow history. The one called A Radical Hope is specifically about plenty, coup, and trauma. Okay, so it's a little bit different in its approach, but they're all very useful. Okay, so that's what I have. Do you have any questions?
I'm just curious, a history is written about from perspective, and the author, like Lynn, brings his culture and his personal experiences and his biases through writing about what he observes and his interactions. How does that reconcile with current Native authors, writers, historians, Crow and otherwise? How does his writing reconcile with their oral history and their re-examination of what happened in their culture that maybe wasn't written, wasn't recorded because of...
Okay, I didn't get the last part there.
The white author, really did not talk about the other side of Native history, whether it's reservation schools like in Canada, and other atrocities. How does that oral history compare or reconcile itself with,
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's very difficult because, primarily because of the boarding school movement, so much tradition was lost, right? And so, how do you regain it? So there's, of course, a lot of language study now, but to some extent, ironically, what a lot of people are doing in order to regain some knowledge of traditions previous to the 20th century is looking at the anthropological material and gathering knowledge about ceremonies, for instance, from that. Now, not all of it is exclusively available in that kind of material, and some of it is was kept within the tribe, depending on the tribe, right? But there is a lot more being done by Native scholars about Native American life in general. History, literature is what I'm most familiar with, but other disciplines also. And the new Native American Studies major at Northern is part of that effort, right? In terms of kind of reconciling Native studies of Native traditions with white historians or other historians' material, that's complicated, right? And I feel complicated as a white person trying to write about this material too. And you have to be very careful, very respectful, and you have to really read deeply to try to make sure that you know what you're talking about. Does that answer your question?
I don't have an answer to the question. I appreciate your perspective because it's, in light of reflection, and not having a long written history, more oral history on the Native side, how do you bring in what's happened? I'm just fascinated by that. not only with native cultures, but any minority group in any country for that matter. How do you reconcile this to what is the history, what do you pass forward?
Yeah, we're having a little hard time with the mask.
Oh,
but, yeah.
that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
Just passing culture on forward, and whether European countries you have your own minority groups, and the United States has minority, Asia has minority groups, and how do you deal with some of the atrocities, misuses, and so on, and still be able to move forward with culture. I don't know. I think you did a good job of answering something that maybe we can't answer yet.
Yeah. Well, the United States and we Americans, we have a long way to go, but I think we're getting there. But we're getting there slowly. But we're getting there, I think. But maybe I'm naive and optimistic. And, yeah. Few people describe me that way, but maybe. Yeah.
We have any other questions? All right, well, let's give Lynn a hand. I'm just going to say a couple other things. We do have a reading tomorrow night at Ishpeming Carnegie Library, and Bartley Siegel is going to be reading. He's the current UP Poet Laureate, and he's going to be reading at 6 o'clock. And I just booked this person today. But on Monday, we have a dedication ceremony for the Josephine Mendamen mural at the library. And I have a friend who is a friend of Josephine Mendamen, Joanne Robertson, who's going to be there and is going to talk about Josephine Mendamen and talk about the Water Walk movement. So I think that's going to be really, really fascinating. And that's going to happen next Monday. It's going to be a Zoom event, so if you want to join on that, that link is already on the Peter White Public Library page, and you can join and hear Joanne Robertson talk about Josephine Mendamen. So that's going to be, I think, a really, really fascinating event. So lots of other stuff. I can't go through it all. You've all been here listening to this wonderful presentation by Lynn. But go to the Peter White Public Library page. You'll find out all the stuff that's upcoming for the NEA Big Read. And I really thank you, and I thank the Marquette Regional History Center for hosting us tonight. They've been a really wonderful partner in promoting all the events that have been happening. So let's give the Marquette Regional History Center a hand as well. So thank you all. Have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you at some more events. And if you have a chance and fill out an evaluation form, please do that so that we can continue to